Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth Podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that most people refuse to talk about, or just quite frankly, are very, very, very uncomfortable talking about. And I call that beyond the grave. We work in the life insurance industry, and part of what we have to have a conversation about is death. And most people don't want to have that conversation. So today, Kira is going to be joining me to have this conversation that she calls morbid. Rightfully so. It is a bit morbid. But on the other hand, it happens to us all. There's no getting out of this predicament called life alive. So we can either embrace it or we can run away and be scared of it. And I think once you look at it and you face it down, it's something that we can have a solid conversation around, because it is going to happen to us all. And it's easy not to have the conversation. So welcome, Kira, and I hope you're excited to talk about this subject as much as I am.
Well, I mean, the subject, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's a very uncomfortable subject, just because it is one of those things that you have to have a serious discussion with somebody in probably one of the worst emotional times of their life. And so that makes it difficult. But I think it's important for people to, understand, like you said, what does happen beyond the grave, and, what the options are and how to best utilize things.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why it's uncomfortable is because it's such an unknown, right? And it's permanent, right? It's not like you can go through it and come out the other end, and still stay on this earth. So it is a permanent situation. But I think part of it is because there's so many questions left unsaid, so many things left undone, that people aren't comfortable talking about it. And what I find working with my clients is the older we get, our priorities change, our thought processes change around that. The younger people don't want to face mortality because they think they're immortal. They're never going to die. And as people get older, they get the realization, that's obviously part of the cycle of life that we live in. So I think it's dependent on where you're at in your age and also in your thought process. But I think it's just really important from many standpoints to come to the realization, that we all die. And so what are we doing? What are we doing to put ourselves ease with that, at peace with that, as well as, what are we doing to put our family in a position to carry on and to create this legacy? And I can tell you, just in my 30 plus years experience of being in this industry, and I've delivered a number of death claims and to family members, and we're the only industry that ever comes with a checkbook. Everybody else comes with a bill. And money isn't the end, doesn't soothe the pain, but it doesn't add to the grief.
Well, and it's like I had a friend tell me one time, we were talking about, having experiences and how life's too short to not spend money on certain things that you want, right? And his phrase, and it kind of made me laugh, but at the same time, it struck a chord with me, was that, a Brinks truck doesn't back up to a gravesite. So you can have all this money in the bank and everything like that, but once you're in the ground, unfortunately, like a Brinks truck is not going to back up and say, oh, by the way, here's all the money you have in your bank. What would you like to do with it now?
Right. And that's part of it too, is that, through the idea of, using this infinite banking concept idea that we are so passionate about and that we believe in so much, that's about how we think and use money. And money isn't the thing that makes us important. It's our mindset and what belief systems we have and what's important to us. That's all the really key stuff. The money part of it is just a measure of the value that you bring to somebody. That's really all money is, right? And so part of what, my belief is, and the reason for this title of Beyond the Grave, is what are we doing to set our families up and the next generations up, not only with money, but with knowledge? Because I really believe if you have money, we see this, we go to, or we watch TV programs that show people that, I think the title of it is How the Lottery Ruined My Life, right? They received all kinds of money. And people that receive money with no plan and no education on how to use it, typically are separated fairly quickly. Nelson Nash said in presentation one time, he says, I have nothing scientific to back this concept up, but he made the premise that if everybody in this world, if all the money in this world was divided equally amongst everybody in the world, that within 10 years, 90% of that money would be back in 10% of the population's hands. And that's not because of a lot of different reasons of oppression or anything else we might talk about. It's just about how we've been taught to think and how we've been taught to think about money. So a good example is when we're going through the process, and hopefully we have generations in our conversations with our clients, and their kids and maybe their kids kids or whoever else is in that conversation. It's like, what are we doing with this money? And then mom or dad pass away again. Nelson used the phrase, when I graduate from this world, what's my legacy going to be? And if I've provided the right knowledge and understanding, they're going to take the money that I provided for them for that legacy, because truly life insurance is the language of love. You have to have a love for somebody in order to have a policy. If you don't love anybody beside yourself, then it's probably not something that you're going to engage in. So if you have this policy and you provide those death benefits, that's step number one. Step number two would have been, what are you doing with that money? What's the plan to do with that money? What have you educated that next generation to do? And there's families in this country, there's names in this country that we would all recognize, as far as being very wealthy people in the country that have done just that. They've taken generation after generation after generation and passed not only money down and increased that amount, ostensibly through probably life insurance, because it's the best and easiest way to transfer that asset, but they've also passed a knowledge down on how to use it. And that knowledge is the real key, because again, money without knowledge is going to be money no more. It's going to be money in somebody else's hand, because again, for the most part, we're a consumer society. We want to spend, versus do we want to control that flow of money in the banking function in our lives, and quite frankly, in our families' lives, and in our grandkids, and so on and so forth. So we want to create that legacy. And that's really what Beyond the Grave is. What are we doing to create this legacy to put the next generation and the generation after that in a better position financially than we've ever been in? And just providing money doesn't do it. We have to provide an understanding and education how to use that and what to use it for.
Well, and I think this is a perfect segue to even actually talk about a more recent example, because as I know this because we've had this conversation multiple times about generational wealth and how important it is, and what the benefits of it are. But it just kind of, as I'm sitting here listening to you talk even further, it reminds me of two policies that we just recently wrote for two younger people who have plans to get married here once hopefully everything with COVID settles down. But unfortunately, one of them, her father passed away and left her money, life insurance, inheritance, whatever. And they turned around and utilized that money to fund two new policies for themselves to then carry on the wealth for once they get married and they have children and their children have children. And so I don't know if that's something that we want to talk about, how, that not necessarily that conversation went with them, but the thought process that they had in coming to you and saying, hey, this is what I want to do.
Right. And that's a great point. And that's kind of where I was going with that is we have people in our lives that loved us so much that they put us on as either beneficiaries. We inherited property, some sort of dollar amount from them. So the next question is, what are we doing to pass that gift along? And it's not like we have to give it up and never use it, but what are we doing to perpetuate that same gift that our grandpa or mom or our rich uncle or whoever it was passed to us? What are we doing to pass that to the next generation in our family? Because they thought so much of us and they thought enough of that process that they said, hey, we're going to pass this along to you. We're going to pass this. And unfortunately, what I don't see is the knowledge to go along with it. Sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. I don't know that there's just a real, solid thought about how we're going to get that done. So what the important part is that these people saw that they were given a tremendous gift. They said, hey, let's do the same thing that dad did for us. Let's do that. Even though we don't have kids yet, we're going to set this up so we can do that for our next generation or our nephews and nieces, whatever it might be. And at the same time, be able to use access to that money to do all the financing that they want to do in their lives. So if we understand life insurance and our life insurance policies as a true asset, just as it is, it's just like a piece of property. This can be the generational transfer that we need to grow this generational wealth within our family. and we use it as the and asset and not as an or asset. And where that goes is that we can have this great death benefit that's going to be provided to somebody. Again, we all die. So the question is, what are we going to have happen at that time of death? Do we want dollars to be provided or not? Do we want the most efficient dollars to be provided or the least efficient dollars to be provided? It's going to happen. So the question is, what are we doing to take control of that situation as much as we possibly can? What we can't do is we can't say when it's going to happen. I think that's the part where everybody has a tough time, and everybody has some apprehensions because we don't know when it's going to happen. And it's quite frankly, it's good. I don't want to know when that's going to happen. If we did, it's a lot easier to plan when we know it's going to happen because we can do a lot of things the day before, right? But we don't want to necessarily know when it's going to happen in our lives. We all hope it's, when we're a long time down the road and we don't have to think about it, we can defer that decision till later. So that's where I think a lot of the apprehension, that's where a lot of the gnashing the teeth, the clutching of hands kind of happen, because we have to come to that realization that we're not on this earth forever, right? We're going to graduate to a better place sometime in the future. And when that happens, the part that we can control is, well, how's that going to affect my family? We can't control it all, but we can control a small part of it, saying, here's something to ease the financial burden that's going to go along with it. It's not going to stop the grief. It's not going to stop the loneliness or whatever else goes along with it, but it's not going to add to the burden of having no dollars to be able to do those things. And I think that's the real key. And that's why I love this industry, is that, again, we're the only industry, and I know we get a lot of grief about being in the insurance industry, but it's the only industry that comes to you and says, hey, sorry for your loss. This is how much your husband, your wife, your dad, your mom, your grandpa and grandpa thought of you. And they have this policy, and here's that next step. Now, what you do with that next step is up to you, is really the key component there, where they have to say, well, what am I going to do to pass on that legacy that was passed to me? And that's really the process of what we call this generational wealth thing, where we're taking dollars that are generated from the death benefit, buying even bigger death benefit, continue to use the cash and the cash resources that came with that. So again, it's the and asset. And then when we die, what have we done to teach the next generation in our family that when we pass away, my son will be taking out a very large policy, hopefully, 4 or 5, 10 times larger than what I passed on to him. And so then he can continue that for his kids in the next generation and the next generation. And what that does, it takes that generation out of servitude to Wells Fargo, takes that generation, those future generations, out of servitude to anybody else that wants to control their financial lives. Because we have a lot of hurdles, or a lot of potholes in this world. If we can just eliminate some of those big potholes in that next generation's lives, and again, part of that comes with discipline. We have to teach them discipline to do the right thing as well. It's just not a check that you can write and then everybody is on a trust fund, because those things will eventually end. Ask the Vanderbilts how well that lack of education has worked out for them. They have a lot of big name properties, but they have no money. Ask the Rockefellers how well, using the strategy we're just talking about, it's exactly what they've been doing since the early 1900s, how well that's worked for them. They've passed generational wealth to 5, 6 generations, 7 generations, doing the same strategy we're talking about, of passing discounted dollars on with the knowledge on, if I need to use it, I need to come to the family financing system that we've set up and say, hey, this is what I want to use the dollars for. It's approved. And then they have to love their family bank or their family financing system as much or more than they love Wells Fargo. So they're willing to pay interest back into that system, because again, now that thing becomes perpetual. I think that's the real key, is that we want to make this thing a perpetual system, that it's good for me. It's benefiting me, what we're doing right now, and with the IBC concept in my life, but hopefully in my son's life, it's even better. And the next generation, it's even better than that. Hopefully it always gets better. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do and what we're trying to teach as I'm working with families, constantly wanting to have the next generation in that conversation. Because if the next generation doesn't understand what's going on, it's just like when I first got in this business, I was probably 4 or 5 years in this business, wrote a term policy on a farmer. He dies. The wife gets at the time, it was a huge death claim. It was, a couple $1 million. And, within about 5 years, because there was no plan, no thought process of what we're supposed to do with it. It was never discussed. Again, that's probably on me. It was never discussed what we're supposed to be doing with this after that would happen, because he was 30 years old. The thought of him passing away was never even in the conversation. But after 5 years, all the kids had new cars, and everybody had kind of pulled at those strings of where those dollars amount was, and the spouse is now 35, and she's coming back and she says, I'm about out of money, because we didn't have a plan, because we didn't treat that asset that her husband thought so much of the family that he left. Great, they got all kinds of all the debt relief, and they got toys and all the other things, but what was the plan? And she was kind of lost. So we pulled back and we said, okay, what we have is what we have, and so we made a plan on how to make it work going forward. And that actually worked out fairly well. Again, she was young enough, and she had a career. And so it's not like she wasn't unable to do the things, but she also had young kids. So for the next 5 years, it was very taxing and stressful for her. But it wasn't once we decided to put together a plan. So the whole idea is that, yeah, a death benefit is exactly what a life insurance policy is designed to do. They're doing it very well. Even during COVID, they they do exactly what insurance companies are supposed to do. And they do it very well. They pay death claims. But when that happens, we have to say, what's the next step? What's our plan? Where are we going to grow family wealth, generational wealth, if we don't have a plan for that family? And we have to get everybody that has an understanding to get involved.
And it's funny, as we're sitting here talking about this, I just, of course, like, my mind goes, and I hear you say things that I haven't heard you say before. And as crazy as this is to say, the IBC cycle, if you will, mirrors the life cycle. If you're trying to put it into a generational wealth scenario, right? So you are born, you live, you procreate, you pass, you're procreate, your offspring does the same thing. They're born, they live.
Right.
So it's in this, I mean, obviously people can't see us as on on this video because they're listening, but as we're drawing a circle, if you think about it, generational wealth is designed to kind of go in a cyclical pattern, right? So you pass on the generational wealth, and it grows, and then it's kind of the same as like the life cycle, right? So you are born, you live, you die. Then your generational, the people underneath you are born, they live, they die. So it kind of follows the life cycle, right?
Well, kind of, but what we try to do is make it more of a linear thing, so it doesn't have to start over again.
But it starts, so when it,
yeah,
quote, again, people can't see the air quotes here, but quote, when it air quote starts over, it's at a different capacity, but it's at a higher and a bigger capacity, but it still is following the same cycle of life, right? Does that make sense, what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we have to add new people, new money all the time. That's kind of the whole thought process, right? If we have nobody to pass our assets to, and it just ends up going to our state and the government gets it, then it's done, right? So again, and part of that is, what are we doing to add new people, new dollars to that cycle? So if you think about it, and again, this is probably for the people that are engineers or people that are car people, it's like a flywheel, right? You have this thing that's in motion. Once it's in motion, it stays in motion. And it doesn't perpetually stay in motion, but if we're doing the things right, it comes as close as we possibly can to be perpetual. Right. And that's really what we want to talk about. Is it takes some effort and takes some time, it takes some planning, it takes some conversation to get that flywheel started. But once it gets going, and once it has that motion and that momentum, and we can just add a little bit of energy to it along the way, it stays in motion the whole time. And that's ultimately what we want to do. And again, part of that energy that we have to add to it is education of the next generation, right? That's always what we have to do. And if we're adding money to it as well, then it's just getting bigger and bigger. It's not it's not shrinking. So hopefully we can add some momentum to that flywheel just by having that next generation come on board, making sure that they understand why we're doing what we do, and they get them to read and educate themselves of, okay, again, it's a very from a selfish standpoint, it's what I want to see happen to all these families that I've had a relationship with. I want to see them get this kind of this financial freedom from the bondage of the current banking system. And we have to do that by educating not just grandpa, mom or dad and the kids, but even the next generation. What are we doing to put into play? Here's the instructions. We have to have a manual to what we have to do next. And then once you get to that second, third, fourth generation, it's really kind of this plug and play. There's not a whole lot of learning because you've watched and you've seen how valuable it's become. So, yeah, to your point, it's got the cycle, but what we want to do is make sure that cycle doesn't have the startup energy, the energy to take to start it up. And that's really what the first person that has to do is got to take this bull by the horn and say, I'm going to start the cycle. I had a client, and I love this visual because he was making the point to me. He says, maybe 20 or 50 years after I'm gone, he says, they're going to point up on the wall a picture of me. He says, that's the person that started our family legacy. He says, that is my motivation because I want to be the person that takes our family out of financial bondage and puts them on the road to freedom. And he says, I want him to be able to point to me. It wasn't out of a position of ego. It was like position of, okay, I'm willing to take the energy and time and money and whatever it takes to get it rolling. And then they can point to me and say, he's the one that got started, but yet point back to themselves that we're going to continue this because we owe it to him to make it go forever.
Well, and in a not necessarily like a way to close it out, but it's kind of a, beyond the grave, and just kind of going back into what you're talking about is beyond the grave, and like you said, the family legacy, like pictures on the wall, right? You want to be the first one. Well, then beyond the grave, then like you said, people point to this picture and they always say, yeah, this is Papa Wade or Grandpa Wade, and this is why we have the legacy that we have, and this is why we have this big old building in Fargo, right? Like Rockefeller,
Right,
like
right.
back to the Rockefeller family, right? And you're known because this is what you set them up. And so beyond the grave, they are still being talked about what they did for their family, which brings it from a morbid topic, as we opened with, to a
Very uplifting topic.
yes, absolutely uplift. Perfect word. Yep.
Very inspirational. And not just if it's me up on that very top picture, hey, that's great. But how about the next generation that really, because each generation has the ability to break it down and to make it fail, right? So each generation becomes almost more important than the very first person. That's kind of the key too, is that what are we doing to put together the manual so people in the next generations understand what it takes to keep this thing rolling? And it can happen for every family. I think that's part of the struggle too, is that people think, well, I got to have wealth to make that happen. It's not wealth that makes it happen. It's determination. It's the ability to learn and listen and think for yourself and not be, not have this conditioned thinking take over your thought process, right? And so money and wealth is created, it's not the other way around. It doesn't take wealth to create this huge family legacy. It takes time and money, and it takes time, money, and effort, discipline to make it all happen. And then you're going to create this large family legacy. So money's only a part of it.
Well, and you bring up a good point, and it's a shameless plug here to mention our podcast on how money works, because one of the things that we talked about is that people think that you have to have wealth in order to follow the IBC path or to have this whole life insurance policy. But it doesn't matter if you make $40,000 a year or you make $400,000 a year or you make $4 million a year. It's not, wealth is what you make of your money, not how much money you have in a roundabout way. So if people are interested in hearing more about that topic and how that correlates to IBC, again, shameless plug, we've got that How Money Works podcast too that definitely dives into that a little bit deeper too.
Thank you for the shameless plug. We need as many of those as we can get.
Anytime. That's what I'm here for.
Because again, we go back to how we started this conversation. There are people that receive millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, and they make a show of how that wrecked their lives. Well, the only reason it wrecked their lives is because they weren't prepared or they had no idea what to do with it. And they eventually end up. So again, it's not the money. It's our thought process. It's the gray matter between our ears and how we think about money. That is the real key. It has nothing to do with the dollars. It has something to do with the dollars. Let me back that up. But it's more importantly how we think and how we use those dollars to perpetuate the system. And then think about all the great things we can do with it. Just kind of as an ending note, if you have a desire to say, hey, I want to give a friend of mine, he talks about, he wants to give $1 million away a year. That's his ultimate goal, to charities. That's what he wants to do. That's his goal. Fabulous. And he knows he can't do it until his other needs are taken care of. So he has that part of his goal. And so he can do so many great things with dollars. Because there's a kind of a misconception out there, I think, in this world that money's evil. No, money's not evil. It's what you do with the money that's evil, right? And so this idea that money will change us. Well, hopefully it changes us for the better, and it gives us opportunities to do those things that we desire and we love in the future. And if we can kind of free up our mind and just imagine that process happening, then that's great. And then we can take this process and say, okay, I'm going to do this process in my life. I'm going to apply this to my life for as long as I'm here. And then I'm going to teach my son or my children to do the same thing when I'm not here, and they can do it themselves, and they can teach that next generation. Passing those things along will make, again, that person on the top of the picture on the wall that's got the family tree, they can all point to them and say, he's the one that started this process to get our family to where it's at today. And then each and every generation after that is going to fill in and say the same thing about their generation. All right. Thank you so much, Kira. This is good. It's exciting. Hopefully we changed your thought about the topic of graduation from this world and life insurance as not being so morbid, but being inspirational.
Maybe a little bit, but death is still morbid. It's still sad, but yes.
It's tough. Yeah, it's sad. It definitely is. We just, like I said, hopefully we can ease some of the results of it. So if you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches, and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.